You belong to me. You have always belonged to me.
The night Verity Calloway turned 20, her father did not bring her flowers. He brought his fists. She lay on the cold stone floor of Ashgrove Manor, her gown torn at the shoulder, her breath coming in sharp, broken pulls. The candle on the mantelpiece threw long shadows across the room as Lord Cornelius Calloway stood over her, his chest heaving, his eyes carrying that hollow fury she had learned to fear before she could read her own name. No one in the county would believe it. To the world outside those walls, Cornelius Calloway was a man of standing, a widower of quiet grief, a father who had kept his daughter sheltered from harm. But Verity knew what sheltered really meant inside this house. It meant silence. It meant locked doors. It meant a secret so enormous it was slowly crushing the life out of her. She pressed one hand flat against the floor and tried to rise. Her father's shadow fell over her. "You belong to me," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "You have always belonged to me." And now, carrying his cruelest secret inside her body, with nowhere to run and no one in the world who knew she was suffering, Verity Calloway faced a choice that no woman should ever have to make. But would she survive long enough to make it? What happens when the monster wearing a father's face is the one holding every key to your freedom? And what price does an innocent woman pay when the truth she carries could destroy an entire dynasty? If this story already has your heart in your throat, you are not ready for what comes next. Subscribe to this channel right now and stay close, because this is only the beginning of Verity's story, and every part is more devastating than the last. Verity Calloway had learned, before she was old enough to mourn it, that survival inside Ashgrove Manor required a particular kind of stillness, not the stillness of peace, the stillness of prey. She had perfected it over 20 years. She knew how to move through a room without drawing breath too loudly. She knew which floorboards to avoid after dark. She knew that when her father's study door was closed, and the house had gone quiet in a certain way, the safest place in the world was the far end of the kitchen garden, crouched among the herbs, pretending to work. The manor itself was beautiful, and that was perhaps the cruelest thing about it. 3 stories of pale limestone rising above the Berkshire countryside, ivy threading up the eastern wall, tall windows catching the morning light like something from a painting. Visitors always paused at the gate. They always said the same thing. What a fine house. What a lucky girl to grow up inside it. Verity never knew how to answer that. Her mother had died when she was 4, and the story Lord Cornelius Calloway told was one of tragic fever, of a delicate woman taken too soon, of a widower who had given everything to raise his daughter alone. It was a story that made older women press their handkerchiefs to their eyes and pat his arm with great tenderness. Verity had heard it so many times she could recite it. She had long stopped believing a single word of it. What she knew of her mother lived only in the back corner of the linen cupboard, inside a small wooden box she had found when she was 9, a miniature portrait, a dried sprig of something that had once been lavender, and a single sentence scratched into the inside of the lid in hurried, unsteady script. "Get out before he decides you are next." Verity had read those words so many times the box no longer needed to be opened for her to see them. They lived behind her eyes now. They followed her through every room of the house and sat beside her at every meal and lay down with her every night when she turned her face to the wall and waited for morning. The housekeeper, Mrs. Thorne, was the closest thing to kindness Ashgrove had ever offered her. A broad, quiet woman of 50, with rough hands and careful eyes. She had worked in the manor since before Verity was born. She never spoke directly about what she saw, but she always left a lamp burning on the kitchen table when the nights grew tense. She always made certain there was something warm waiting, and sometimes when Verity came downstairs with her jaw set and her eyes too steady, Mrs. Thorne would simply place a hand on her shoulder and hold it there for a moment without saying a word. It was the only touch in the house that did not make Verity flinch. There was also Prentice, the groundskeeper's son, a year older than Verity and entirely too observant for his own safety. He had grown up on the estate and knew its rhythms the way he knew the weather. He had never asked her outright what went on inside the manor walls, but twice in the past year he had appeared in the kitchen garden at odd hours with his jaw tight and his eyes moving toward the upper windows, and both times Verity had shaken her head at him with enough force that he had stayed where he was. She did not want his help, not because she doubted him, but because she knew what helping her could cost. Her father had influence that stretched far beyond the county, magistrates who owed him favors, clergymen who relied on his generosity, a reputation so carefully constructed that a whisper against him would die before it ever reached the right ears. Verity had no money of her own, no family outside these walls, no education beyond what had been permitted, which was enough to keep her useful, but never enough to make her dangerous. That was the balance her father maintained with great precision. But something had shifted in recent weeks. She could feel it the way you feel a change in the air before a storm arrives. He watched her differently now. There was a calculation in it, something cold and methodical, that was different from the usual rage. It reminded her of a man studying a problem he had already decided how to solve. And 3 mornings in a row, she had woken before dawn with her body aching in ways she could not explain, and a fear sitting so deep in her chest it had no shape and no name, only weight. The kind of weight that tells you, without words, that something is already in motion, that the moment you have been dreading has not yet arrived, but it is close. It is very, very close. It was Mrs. Thorne who found her first. Verity had been in the still room since before the household stirred, grinding dried rosemary into powder, because her hand needed something to do, and her mind had not let her sleep. The morning was grey and close, the kind that presses against the windows and makes the world outside feel far away. She had not heard her father's footsteps in the corridor above. She had not heard anything, and that, she realized too late, was the problem. She only understood something was wrong when Mrs. Thorne appeared in the doorway, with her face arranged into that particular blankness she used when she was frightened, and trying not to show it. "He's asking for you," Mrs. Thorne said. In the study now, Verity set down the pestle. She smoothed her apron with both hands, a habit that did nothing except give her fingers somewhere to be. She walked the corridor slowly, not because she wanted to delay it, but because she knew that arriving too quickly read as eagerness, and eagerness invited testing. The study door was open. That was unusual. Lord Cornelius Calloway stood at the window with his hands clasped at his back, watching the grounds below as if he were surveying something he owned. Which, Verity reminded herself, was exactly how he saw everything in his line of vision. He did not turn when she entered. "Close the door," he said. She did. "Sit down." She sat in the chair across from his desk, the one with the short front legs that had never been fixed, the one that always left the person sitting in it angled slightly forward, slightly off balance. She had never believed it was an accident. He turned then. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking, and in that silence, Verity felt the familiar arithmetic of his gaze, the way he always seemed to be calculating something when he looked at her, measuring the distance between what she was and what he required her to be. "I have had a conversation," he said, "with Lord Aldrich Fenmore." The name landed without immediate meaning. Verity knew of Fenmore the way you know of weather systems in other counties. Distant, powerful, not yet your problem. "He has expressed interest," her father continued, moving toward the desk with the unhurried ease of a man who has already decided an outcome, "in a private arrangement, one that would be mutually beneficial." Verity kept her expression still. "What kind of arrangement?" He sat. He opened the top drawer of his desk, removed a folded document, and placed it in the center of the surface between them. He did not push it toward her. He simply left it there, visible, like something already decided. "The kind," he said, "that does not require your opinion." The cold came then, not from the room, but from somewhere inside her sternum, spreading outward slowly, the way ice forms on still water. She looked at the document, and then at her father's face, and she understood, with the specific clarity that comes only from having survived 20 years inside this house, that this was not a conversation. It had never been a conversation. He had called her here to inform her the way you inform furniture of its new position in a room. "I won't," she said. The word came out quieter than she intended and steadier than she expected. She felt it leave her mouth the way you feel a stone leave your hand before you've fully decided to throw it. Her father's expression did not change. That was what made it terrible. Not the anger she had braced for, but the complete absence of surprise, as if he had known she would say it and had already calculated exactly what came next. "You misunderstand your position," he said softly. He stood, and Verity rose before she had made the decision to rise, some animal part of her already moving before her mind caught up. She took one step backward and felt the edge of the chair behind her knee and stopped. He crossed the room slowly. He stopped close enough that she could smell the tobacco and cold morning air that clung to his coat. He reached out and took her chin in one hand, not roughly but precisely, the way you hold a thing you have always owned and intend to go on owning. "You will do what I require," he said. "You have always done what I require, and if you have forgotten why, I am quite prepared to remind you." She pulled her face away. She had never done that before. For a single suspended moment, something shifted in his eyes, not anger yet. Something worse, the quiet recalibration of a man who has encountered a variable he had not expected. Verity walked out of the study without permission and without looking back, and with every step down the corridor, she felt the certainty building in her chest, like pressure before an eruption, that she had just done something she could not undo, and that whatever was coming for her now would be worse than anything that had come before. She was right. She just did not yet know how much worse it would become when she discovered what Lord Fenmore's arrangement was truly designed to conceal, and what her father had already done to make certain she had no way out. She did not go back to the still room. She went to the kitchen garden instead, walking fast enough that her skirts caught against the low hedgerow bordering the path, and she stood among the herb beds with her arms wrapped around herself and her breath coming in short, controlled pulls, staring at nothing and trying to think. The garden had always been where she processed things too large for the walls of the house. As a child, she had come here after the worst nights, pressing her palms flat into the cold earth as if the ground itself could absorb some of what she carried. It still worked, barely, enough to keep her upright. She replayed the study, the document on the desk, her father's hand on her face, the precise way he had said, "You will do what I require," as if it were simply a fact of nature, as fixed and inarguable as the turning of seasons. She had pulled away from him. Even now, standing in the thin morning air, she could not fully account for where that had come from. 20 years of careful stillness, and something had cracked open in a single motion. She did not know whether to call it courage or catastrophe. Prentice found her 20 minutes later. He came around the side of the garden wall with a barrow and stopped when he saw her face. He set the barrow down. "What happened?" he said. "It was not a question, nothing that concerns you. Verity." She looked at him. He had known her since childhood, this quiet and steady young man with soil permanently worked into the creases of his knuckles, and she had spent years being careful not to lean on that knowing, because she understood what leaning cost. But something in her was too tired this morning for the usual distance. "He is making an arrangement," she said, "with a man named Fenmore. I don't know the full terms, but I know it involves me, and I know I was not meant to understand it as fully as I do." Prentice was still for a moment. Then, carefully, he said, "Aldrich Fenmore of Dunmore Park." She looked at him sharply. "You know him. My father does. Fenmore uses this county for certain business my father has always refused to touch." He paused, and the pause had weight to it. "He is not a man who arranges things for simple reasons, Verity. When Fenmore wants something from a family, it is because that family has something he needs." Kept quiet. The cold returned to her chest. She thought about the document, the way her father had not even attempted to explain it, the way he had looked at her not with the usual anger, but with something more deliberate, more managed, a transaction being completed. What would he need kept quiet, she said, mostly to herself. Prentice did not answer that, but the look he gave her before he picked up the barrow and moved away told her that he had a thought he was choosing not to say, and that it frightened him. That frightened her more than any answer would have. She spent the afternoon doing the only thing available to her, moving through the house invisibly, listening. It was a skill she had built over years without ever naming it. She knew how to dust a mantelpiece while absorbing a conversation 2 rooms over. She knew how to refold linens in the upstairs corridor while the study door stood cracked open below. She had gathered more information this way than her father would ever believe, because he had never once considered that the girl he had spent 20 years making small might have spent those same years becoming watchful. What she gathered that afternoon was fragmentary and incomplete, and enough to make her sit down on the floor of the linen cupboard with her back against the shelves and her face in her hands. Fenmore had been to the house before, not recently. Years ago, when Verity was too young to be introduced to company. Mrs. Thorne had been there then, and when Verity found her in the kitchen near evening and asked her, quietly, what she remembered of those visits, the housekeeper went very still, in a way that was different from her usual careful stillness. "I remember that your father was a different man after each one," Mrs. Thorne said finally, not looking up from the pot she was attending. Calmer, like a man who had just been reminded that someone else knew where the bodies were buried. She said nothing more, but her hand on the spoon was not entirely steady. Verity went to bed that night with the sentence from her mother's box sitting directly behind her, eyes brighter than it had ever been. "Get out before he decides you are next." For the first time in her life, she did not read it as a warning from the past. She read it as instructions for tomorrow. She was gone from her bed before the house fully woke, not fleeing, not yet. She had no money, no horse, and nowhere certain to go, and she understood with cold clarity that running blind from Ashgrove would deliver her directly into the kind of danger that had no remedy. What she needed first was the document, the one her father had left on the desk, like something already finished. If she could read it fully, understand what had been signed and what had not. She would know how much time she had and what, precisely, she was running from. The study was unlocked. Her father had never bothered locking it against her, because he had never believed she would dare enter it alone. That belief had protected him for 20 years. She moved through the door in the pale early light and went directly to the desk. The document was gone from the surface. She opened the top drawer and found it immediately, folded once, her father's seal pressed into the wax at the corner, with the kind of finality that made her stomach turn. She opened it and read it standing up, because sitting felt too much like settling. It took her 3 readings to understand the full shape of it, and by the third her hands were no longer entirely steady, but her mind had gone very quiet in the way it always did, when something became too large for feeling and crossed over into pure cold fact. Fenmore was not arranging a marriage. He was arranging a transfer. The language was careful and buried under the formal constructions of legal writing, but the meaning was plain once you knew how to look for it. Verity was to be moved to Dunmore Park under the terms of a private guardianship, her father relinquishing all legal claim in exchange for the settlement of a debt, so large it had apparently been accumulating for the better part of a decade. She was not a bride in this document. She was a settlement. A line item in a ledger between 2 men who had been conducting business with each other's secrets for years. And at the bottom, in her father's hand, the date. 4 days from now. She folded the document exactly as she had found it, replaced it in the drawer, and walked out of the study. She moved through the corridor, up the stairs, back to her room, and sat on the edge of the bed, with her palms flat on her knees and the full weight of it pressing down on her chest. 4 days. She thought of Prentice. She thought of Mrs. Thorne's unsteady hand on the spoon. She thought of her mother's scratched, desperate sentence inside the wooden box. And she thought of the child she now knew, with quiet and devastating certainty she was carrying, a fact she had been refusing to name for 3 weeks, because naming it made it real and real made it unbearable. But unbearable, she was learning, was simply what survival looked like from the inside. She was still sitting there when she heard her father's footsteps on the stairs, and she knew from the rhythm of them that he had discovered she had been in the study. He always knew. The man had an animal awareness of his own territory that had never once failed him in 20 years of governing this house. The door opened without a knock. He stood in the doorway and looked at her with that new expression she had been seeing for weeks, the one that was not anger but calculation, and beneath the calculation something she had not identified until this moment, something that looked almost like relief. As though he had been waiting for her to understand, and now that she did, a phase of the operation was complete. "You read it," he said. She did not deny it. "Then you understand," he said, moving into the room, "that there is no version of the next 4 days in which you leave this house on your own terms." She stood. She did not know she was going to until she was already upright, and the standing itself felt like a declaration, the way pulling her face from his hand had felt in the study. Small rebellions that cost everything and changed nothing and still, somehow, needed to happen. "I understand more than you think I do," she said. "I understand what Fenmore holds over you. I understand why you cannot refuse him. And I understand." Her voice was not shaking, and she needed it not to shake, so she held on to that with everything she had. "That you have known about this child for longer than I have, and that is why the date is 4 days from now, and not 4 months. Something crossed his face, fast and then gone. "You are very clever," he said softly, "for someone with nowhere to go." He reached for her and she stepped back, and her heel struck the leg of the bed frame, And for one terrible moment the room tilted, and she saw it clearly, the future that existed if she stayed, if she submitted, if she let 4 days one day become a carriage to Dunmore Park. She saw it the way you see the bottom of something deep and dark when you look over the edge of it, and she decided in that moment that she would rather fall than be pushed. "I am leaving," she said. "Tonight." Her father smiled. It was the worst smile she had ever seen on a human face. "I know," he said. "I am counting on it." She had 3 hours before the house went fully dark, and she used every minute of them. The first thing she did was find Mrs. Thorne. She did not explain everything. There was not time, and there was not need. She simply looked at the housekeeper in the kitchen doorway and said, quietly and without drama, that she was leaving before morning, and that she needed to know if there was anything in this house that belonged to her, mother that she did not yet know about. Mrs. Thorne looked at her for a long moment. Then she went to the far end of the kitchen, lifted a loose stone near the base of the hearth that Verity had walked past 10,000 times without ever questioning, and withdrew a small cloth bundle tied with cord. She placed it in Verity's hands without a word. Inside was money. Not a great sum, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to move. Verity looked up at the housekeeper and understood in the space of a breath that Mrs. Thorne had been holding this for years, waiting. Not knowing when or whether the moment would come, but keeping the possibility alive. The way you keep candle going in a window for someone who may or may not be finding their way home through the dark. "Your mother asked me to hold it," Mrs. Thorne said simply. "She said I would know when." Verity pressed the woman's hand between both of hers and held it for a moment, and then let go, because if she did not let go immediately, she would not be able to leave, and leaving was the only thing that mattered now. She found Prentice at the stable yard, just as the last grey light was leaving the sky. He had a horse already saddled. She had not asked him to. He simply stood beside it with his jaw set, and his eyes steady, and when she opened her mouth, he shook his head once. "Don't tell me where you're going," he said, "so that when he asks me, I can look him in the face." She nodded. She put her foot in the stirrup, and then stopped and looked back at him. This young man who had spent years keeping a careful distance to protect himself, and had quietly kept watch anyway, and she said the only thing that felt true enough to be worth the breath. "You are a better man than anyone in that house deserves." He said nothing. He stepped back. She rode. She did not look at the manor as she passed it. She had spent 20 years inside those pale limestone walls, and she gave herself the full length of the drive to feel whatever needed to be felt about leaving them, and by the time she reached the gate she had felt it, and it was done, and she kept riding. What she carried with her was not small. She knew that. A child not yet visible. A body that bore the evidence of years of a violence no court would name. A truth so enormous that if it ever reached the right ears, it would detonate her father's carefully constructed world like a charge beneath a foundation. That last part she turned over slowly as the miles opened up around her. She had not planned beyond escape. Escape had been enormous enough to fill every corner of her thinking for the past 12 hours. But now, with the cold air moving against her face, and the horse steady beneath her, and Ashgrove falling behind her in the dark, she found her mind moving forward in a way it had never been permitted to before. She thought about what she knew. The document, the debt, the years of arrangement between her father and Fenmore, 2 men who had been governing each other's secrets, like a shared economy. She thought about what Mrs. Thorne knew, and what Prentice's father knew, and how knowledge, when it belonged to the right people, became something other than burden. It became leverage. She did not allow herself to feel powerful. That was not what this was, and she was too honest with herself to pretend otherwise. She was a woman alone on a dark road, carrying a child, carrying bruises, carrying the accumulated weight of a life lived under a man who had treated her existence as a resource to be managed. She was exhausted in a way that went past her body and into something older and deeper. But she was moving, under her own direction, at her own pace, toward a horizon she had chosen. That was new, that was entirely and completely new. She thought of her mother's words inside the wooden box, and she understood them differently now than she ever had before. Not as a warning from a woman who had failed to save herself, as a message from a woman who had done the only thing left available to her, who had found one small way to reach forward through time and place something useful in her daughter's hands. Her mother had not been defeated. She had been waiting. Verity pressed her heels gently against the horse's flanks and rode harder into the dark. Behind her, at Ashgrove Manor, Lord Cornelius Calloway stood at the window of his study and watched the empty drive, and said nothing for a very long time. He had told her he was counting on her leaving. He had said it to frighten her, to make her doubt herself, to plant the idea that escape was itself a trap. But the study drawer was open beside him, and the document was gone. She had taken it on the way out. He did not yet know that. He would by morning. And by morning, Verity Calloway would be somewhere he could not reach her, holding in her hands the one piece of paper that could end him, deciding slowly and with great care exactly what she intended to do with it. She rode until the horse needed rest, and her own body could no longer argue against stopping. The inn she found was small and unremarkable, sitting at a crossroads, 3 counties from Berkshire. The kind of place where the proprietor asked no questions, because the guests who stopped there at odd hours of the night had long since taught him that questions were bad for business. She paid with her mother's money, took the smallest room available, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed, in the dark, for a long time before she lit the candle. Then she took the document from inside her coat and read it again. The 3rd county over was where a man named Aldrich Fenmore had built his reputation. The 4th county over was where Lord Cornelius Calloway had built his, and sitting precisely between them, in the jurisdiction of a magistrate named Sir Orland Vesey, was a court of record that her father had spent considerable energy cultivating, and that Fenmore had spent equal energy avoiding. She knew about Sir Orland Vesey, because her father had spoken of him exactly once, briefly, and with a contempt so specific it had lodged in her memory. He called him an inconvenient man, a man too concerned with the letter of things. Verity had filed that away at the time without knowing why. She knew why now. She spent what remained of the night writing, not with flourish or formality, but with the plain, sequential precision of someone who understands that the truth does not need decoration to be devastating. She wrote what she knew. She wrote what she had witnessed. She wrote the years of it, the specific and nameable and provable years of it, and she wrote what the document in her hand confirmed about the nature of the arrangement her father had constructed, and what it revealed about the decade of transactions beneath it. She wrote about the child she was carrying. That part she wrote last, and she wrote it without flinching, because flinching was a luxury she had already spent. By the time the sky outside the small window began to lighten, she had produced something that was not a plea and not a complaint, but a record. The kind of record that, placed in front of the right person, could not be quietly folded away and forgotten. She slept for 2 hours. She woke with the kind of clarity that comes only after the body has finally surrendered to exhaustion and come out the other side of it. And then, because the morning felt like it required a beginning rather than a continuation, she did something she had not done in years. She sat at the small table beside the window and ate breakfast slowly, watching the crossroads below come to life with carts and early travelers. And she allowed herself, carefully and without sentimentality, to think about what came next. There was a woman in the nearest town, a Mrs. Aldgate, whom Prentice's father had mentioned once in passing as someone who had helped women in difficult circumstances find footing when the ground had been taken from them. Verity did not know more than the name and the town. She held on to both. There was the document, and there was her written record, and there was the child, and there was her own testimony. And while none of these things individually constituted safety, together they constituted something harder to dismiss than a single frightened woman on the run from a powerful man. Together they constituted a case. She did not let herself imagine the outcome too specifically. She had learned too young that hope constructed in too much detail becomes a liability. But she allowed herself the outline of it, a hearing, a record entered. Two men whose arrangement could no longer breathe in the dark, brought into the kind of light they had spent years and considerable money avoiding. Her father had told her he was counting on her leaving. He had not counted on her thinking. That had always been his most expensive mistake. 20 years of making her small, and he had never once considered that smallness, sustained long enough, teaches a person exactly where all the gaps are, exactly which stones are loose, exactly which names to remember, and which silences mean more than words. She had been his prisoner and his student simultaneously, and she was quite certain he did not know the second part. 3 weeks later, Sir Orland Vesey received a package at his private address. It contained a document bearing Lord Cornelius Calloway's seal and a handwritten account of 37 pages that he later described to his clerk as the most precise and damning record of sustained private criminality he had encountered in 22 years on the bench. Lord Cornelius Calloway was taken from Ashgrove Manor on a Tuesday morning without drama or ceremony, which was, Verity felt, entirely appropriate for a man who had conducted his worst acts without drama or ceremony. Fenmore's name appeared in the proceedings that followed. His reputation did not survive them. Mrs. Thorne was given the house to manage pending legal resolution, and she accepted the responsibility with the same quiet steadiness with which she had accepted everything else. Prentice never asked what had happened. He simply, on the morning the news reached the estate, went back to work in the grounds, with something different in the set of his shoulders. Something lighter. Verity was not there to see any of it directly. She was 3 counties away in a modest set of rooms above a bookshop, tended to by Mrs. Aldgate and 2 other women whose histories she did not yet fully know, but whose presence felt, for the first time in her life, like something she had not had to survive in order to reach. It felt like being among people. Her daughter was born on a cold morning in early March. She was small and loud and entirely healthy, and Verity held her in the pale winter light coming through the window and thought about names. She named her Emmeline, for no reason except that it sounded like the beginning of something. Outside, the world continued its arrangements and its cruelties and its carefully constructed deceptions. Verity knew this. She had no illusions about the size of what one woman's record could change in a world built to protect men like her father from accountability. But one man was no longer in it the way he had been, and one woman who had been made invisible for 20 years was sitting in a pool of mourning, light with her daughter in her arms, visible to no one in particular, and entirely, permanently, and irrevocably herself. That was not everything, but it was enough to begin. And sometimes, beginning is the bravest thing a person can do. Did Verity get everything she deserved in the end? Did justice truly reach the men who believed themselves untouchable? And what do you think little Emmeline's life will look like growing up in a world her mother fought to make safer? If this story moved you, if Verity's courage stayed with you even for a moment, then you already know what to do. Please subscribe to this channel and stay with us, because there are more stories waiting, more women whose voices have been buried, and whose courage deserves to be told. We are so grateful you watched this one all the way to the end. You are exactly the kind of audience that makes this work worth doing. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Now hit that subscribe button and do not go anywhere.